All right, we are flying through this module. We are on to lesson 3, which is the final lesson of module 4. So in this lesson, I'll cover everything you need to know to get started on the right foot. These are the steps you need to take prior to the official onboarding sequence of events. The next module is all about onboarding. These are the preliminary items that you need to knock out before you get into onboarding. And with that, let's talk about those preliminary steps. When a client says they're ready to move forward, there's a few things you need to do before you can actually start managing their PPC campaigns. The first of which is sending out a services agreement. I'll cover that in depth. Then you'll want to send out your first invoice. You'll want to gain account access and then schedule the kickoff call. But we'll talk about each of those a little bit more in depth. But before we do that, I just wanted to provide a real life example of next steps. So this builds off of the example that I showed in the last lesson where I followed up. They wanted to see the scope of work and they're like, great, let's get started. I want to work together. This is the exact response that I sent that outlines all of those next steps. I mentioned that I'll send over a DocuSign with the scope details for item 1. That's the item in my services catalog that she said she wanted. And then I also mentioned that I'll send out the first invoice. Once those are finalized, I'll get started on the foundational items and send over times for a kickoff call. So again, that recall of what we're doing and then letting the client know all of the next steps really helps them know that 1, I'm a professional, but 2, they can kind of just sit back and relax. They don't have to think about PPC anymore because I'm in here and I'm guiding the ship. And then you'll also notice that I included links here for access. So I'll cover that a little bit later on. But that's one of those things that I want to get ironed out as soon as possible because everything hinges on me getting access to their ad accounts. All right, so let's talk about sending out the services agreement. I put together a service agreement for every new client that I onboard. This is not a contract. I don't like to lock my clients into contracts at all. It is, however, an outline of what I'm responsible for and what's included in the scope of work, but also more importantly, what's not included. I also mention in these the channels that I'll be managing and which ones that I won't manage. So for example, I don't manage Meta ads or TikTok ads. So I make that very clear in the service agreement. And I find too that this really helps prevent scope creep, which is a huge bonus in my opinion. So the service agreement gets sent to the client via DocuSign. And I do require that they sign and date it. Tip here is that you can start with DocuSign for free, and I think you get a few, maybe 3 or 4 free sends before you have to pay, but I think it's only something like $15 a send, so it's not very expensive at all. And I'm also pretty upfront about sending this over. I just make sure to tell them that it's a service agreement and not a contract, but I do need their signature in order to move forward into kickoff. All right, so let's talk about what else is included in my service agreement. In addition to clearly outlining what I will and won't be doing for the scope of work, I also reiterate how much the fee is per month, and I make sure to mention specifically that the fee is in addition to ad spend. It's not inclusive of ad spend, and that ad spend needs to be covered by the client on their own credit card. I say that because I've seen some agencies do pass-through billing where they cover the client's ad spend on their company credit card. It can be a nightmare, and I just don't want to deal with that, and I don't recommend that route for freelancers. So I make it very clear that the fee is the service fee and that they are also responsible for their own ad spend on their own credit card. Additionally, I outline my exit clause in the service agreement as well. This basically says that the client or myself can end the agreement at any time with a 30-day written notice, no fee attached, no penalties, no nothing, just as long as it's in writing with a bit of a heads up. We'll part ways amicably. And then for the billing schedule, I send my invoices out on the 1st for the month's upcoming services. So I bill in advance, not in arrears. And I also make sure that they know I invoice on a net 15 billing cycle, so they have 15 days to pay my invoice. Additionally, I put a limit of liability clause in there, so the maximum damages can't exceed more than the amount of 3 months of service. This is just a CYA measure. I put that in there just in case something were to happen. God forbid they want to recoup all of their service fees for a year. This clause makes it clear that it can't exceed more than 3 months of services. And then finally, my service agreement has fields for the contact email, address, and phone number, just so that I have their contact information. All right, now let's move on to sending the first invoice. Once the client signs the agreement, it's time to send out the first invoice, which is awesome. So I used to prorate based on where we were at in the month when we started. However, since the first month is always the busiest, I stopped doing that and I just charge my regular fee right from the start. Even when I'm onboarding them, if it's halfway through the month, I'll still charge the full fee. Going more tactically, I use QuickBooks, but you can use whatever invoicing software you want. But I do highly, highly, highly recommend that this is something you have sorted out before you start working with clients. You don't want to have to choose an invoicing software and configure it while a new client is signing on. That's just a nightmare. And then for every invoice in the description/services section within the invoice, I'll put a list of all of the onboarding activities for the first month, so they're getting a preview of what they will receive in return for their advanced fee. Let's move on to the next piece, which is gaining account access. This is technically a foundational piece of new client onboarding, but I wanted to include it here because it's so important. I like to try to get access ASAP because this is something that can really hold up progress when you're first starting with a client, and it has the potential to lead to quite a bit of client frustration if you don't handle it right. Like I've shown here in my email example, I ask for access when I send the follow-up next steps. So you'll see those links here. Those are actually links to a Notion guide that I put together that all of my new clients can reference. So I've included my Notion access template for you in the course resources section. This is actually something that I put together a while ago when I noticed that some clients were having issues with figuring out how to grant me access. So to make this your own, all you need to do is go in and click this duplicate icon up at the top, and that essentially allows you to make a copy that you can then customize. Right up at the top, you'll want to change this background image and then really this whole first page, but everything within the channels is ready to go. I wrote it in a client-facing voice, and so you in the instruction is the client, and then the PPC expert is referred to as I. So I didn't put Emily Wood anywhere to where you're going to have to find and replace things. All of these channel specific instructions are ready to go. And you'll see when you click on one of these channels, I'll pick on LinkedIn Ads Access, for example, it's all screenshot led. And so I went step by step for every part of the process and then put boxes around where the client would need to go, and then also provided some additional information as well. It's a pretty robust resource. I even included channels that I don't directly manage, like Meta Ads Access, because Meta Ads Access is still such a pain. All right, so like I said, you can just duplicate that and then you can remove my intro page and change that to fit your branding. So I wanted to make sure that you know that that resource is in there as you're asking for access. All right, scheduling the kickoff call. So I'll send a separate email about scheduling the kickoff call because there's plenty to go off of from my previous email. So I'll include a few days and times for the client to choose from. And then I like to have the kickoff usually a week after they sign, just so that I've got some time to start digging in and creating the 90-day plan. Reasons for the kickoff: I want to present the 90-day plan to the client, and I also want to showcase some initial research. And that's really important to me because, one, there's a lot of trust that goes into bringing on a new freelancer, new contractor, new vendor to manage PPC. So I want to put my best foot forward, and I want to let them know that I have a plan for the future. Like for the next 3 months, these are kind of my focus areas. But again, I want their input. So I want to be able to present this plan on the kickoff call, get their input, get their feedback, and make any adjustments as needed. And with that too, I want to provide some initial research. Oftentimes what this looks like is, especially if I'm managing LinkedIn ads, I'll go in and I'll do a breakdown, or I'll showcase a breakdown of how I'm thinking about configuring the audience targeting. And then I can get their feedback and gauge their interest on that plan moving forward. I also provide status updates on work completed so far. Most of the time, this is around getting their conversion tracking set up or in a better spot than it was when I started. And then I also want to highlight any blockers on the client's end that I need to resurface to the top to get resolved pretty quickly. And then from there, before we hang up, my big to do is to get our recurring client meetings scheduled. And so I'll pull up my calendar, and on the call, I get their recurring meeting scheduled. And in this slide, I show an example of what that looks like. So again, I'm excited to have you on board. At this point, we were all set on access. So I let them know that. And then I also outline here my immediate next steps on my end. And then I propose some times for scheduling our kickoff call. And then you'll see a big gray box under request. I had to blank that out because that was very specific to the client and their competitors and their strategy. But if I have any outlying requests that I want handled before the kickoff call, then I'll add that into my email as well. Again, there's a lot of communication that happens, especially after they sign and as we're getting ramped up. I find that this just really helps establish more trust. They're not wondering what I'm doing. I'm proactively letting them know. And so that's just really important for me and how I manage my clients, just to be very communicative, especially at the very beginning. All right. So wrapping up this lesson and this module. This lesson was a bit on the shorter end, but it does lead perfectly into the next module, which is all about client onboarding. But before heading over there, I do have some action items. First of which is to create and finalize your scope of work if you haven't already. Either create your own or you can use it based on the template that I provided. And then from there, I want you to create a services agreement. You can find these online, but I highly, highly, highly recommend getting a legal professional to review it before you actually send and use it on clients. Third here is to determine your invoicing software if you haven't already and configure it. So learn how to send an invoice before you actually need to. I did not do this and I really wished I did because my first invoice, I was really scrambling. So learn from my mistakes. And then lastly, check out my Notion Access Guide, make your own by duplicating it, and then you can customize it from there. And with that, we are officially done with Module 4. Once you've completed these action items, head on over to Module 5, where I'm covering everything you need to know to have a successful client onboarding. So with that, I will see you over there.